there's plenty of evidence to suggest that people will always default to a convenient answer versus a better answer that requires a little bit more work. So the models were designed to be convenient and designed to be helpful and designed to be confident sounding, right? Why is it not answering everything correctly? That's going to be problematic. So building AI safety, building more explicit explanations and helping people sort of understand where did this information come from. There's a lot to be done there, but I think there's traps, right? And we're going to have to navigate some pretty serious ones.
Hi, I'm Boaz, founder and CEO of Augmented AI, and I'm excited that you're tuning in to the Shift AI podcast, a show that explores what it takes to thrive and adapt to the changing workplace in the digital age of remote work and AI. In today's episode, I'm thrilled to have Chris Willis as our guest. Chris is the Chief Design Officer at Domo, a data analytics and visualization platform that helps companies optimize critical business processes at scale. If you're someone interested in the way that AI tools are being used to power data and analytics inside organizations, you are not going to want to miss this episode. We also want to send out a special thank you to Augmented AI for sponsoring this episode. This is going to be a great show, and we are super excited to talk to Chris today. We can't wait to learn more from him. Let's get to it. All right, Chris, welcome to the Shift AI podcast. I'm super excited to have you on today.
Oh, same. Thanks for inviting me.
So I want to start and talk a little bit about your job experience, because you've had a long history of jobs. And I think it's interesting to look at where you started and kind of where you are now, given all the things that have happened from a technology standpoint. And so I noticed that early in your career, you were in the media business. You actually worked for papers. You worked for the Detroit Free Press. You've always kind of had a design angle, and I'll let you kind of explain more about that. But you moved into working for technology companies, creative director at Ancestry. You were the co-founder and VP at Footnote. Hypergene Solutions, you were head of user experience and design. And now you're the chief design officer at Domo. And we're going to get a little bit more into talking about the way that that is fitting into the product that you guys have. I think it's really, really interesting to think about design thinking as a service. And I want you to tell us more about that. But I want you to kind of just think back on your career. Are there some things about the way that media has changed over time that show up for you now?
Yeah. The perspective, it's weird when you mentioned, hey, you were started in newspapers, and that seems like a century ago, right? I mean, that it was a very different time. However, I started in newspapers not because of, an interest in necessarily journalism outright, but I was really interested in figuring out how can I inform people to be, build their awareness, to make better decisions, to vote better, and I fell into that in a very strange way because my work in college, what I started college for in terms of, I was computer science and international marketing and finance, didn't align with any of that. So,
yeah,
I think I started as a creative misfit right from the get-go, never over specializing in one thing, but always having a real desire to connect information and people together for better outcomes, whatever that might be, whether it's democracy or, making a better decision at your job.
Now you're in Utah now, but is that where you grew up?
No, I grew up in New Hampshire, just on the southern border by Massachusetts. Yeah, I grew up on a small lake, just running around outside, doing things that, kids don't do a lot of anymore, unfortunately.
Did you grow up pretty creative? I mean, was design always part of the things you did as a young person? Like, what was your first job where you actually got paid, and, were your parents super creative? Like, what was that back then?
Yeah, that is a great question. Looking back on it, I think, looking forward, there's a lot of uncertainty. Looking back, things seem to make a lot of sense, right? It's like, of course, that was the path. And at my house, both parents started off as they were scientists. I think when they met, they were getting their master's in chemical engineering. And my mom was a classical pianist. My dad was a jazz drummer. So we always had music. We always had interesting people stopping by and staying for indefinite amounts of time. My mother was also a painter and an educator. So a lot of these things, along with being very funny and really encouraging us to be curious. For my mother, she was a ended up becoming an assistant professor of early childhood development. So, understanding how the brain works, how the brain develops, how creativity works. I remember many times we would go on long bus, like car rides,
Yeah.
and all we would have is a journal. She would just give us a piece of paper, or a book of paper and a pen. And we're like, but we're bored. And she's like, that's wonderful. I love that you're bored. What are you going to do about it? And so we learned how to, I think over time, really develop new ways of kind of thinking and entertaining ourselves and exploring ideas. So I don't know. It was such an interesting time to grow up and to have such interesting parents who were, kind of misfits themselves in a way. They didn't quite fit in. They were interested in everything. So, that encouragement was really, really formative for me.
Well, the work that you're doing now resonates with me. I went to architecture school at the University of Washington and got my master's in architecture. And I spent a lot of time thinking about IDEO strategies for design thinking. And I read their books and understood the ways that they thought about that. And when I worked at Meta, we also deployed that IDEO strategy on a lot of the projects that we were working on. So can you describe design thinking for the audience, just so that everybody's on the same page in terms of what that means and how that's showing up for you now?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's often overlooked. So I'm delighted you have some experience with it. For me, design thinking really starts with trying to question the question. So many times we think in terms of sort of predefined solutions, right? As opposed to thinking, well, what are the different elements that go into creating something better, right? So as a designer, I think you automatically need to be an optimist and you need to be a futurist, right? You need to be almost like you're creating sci-fi, you're living in that world, and hopefully you're creating a better future. Otherwise, I don't think there's much of a job for you. But design thinking, where I see people kind of misread that discipline, is in that they apply sort of the same problem solving techniques that they apply to well understood problems to problems that are not well understood. Design thinking, I think, helps with what we would call wild problems versus tame problems. So the tradition of design thinking, in a way, goes all the way back to Socrates, right? With sort of first principles thinking, where you're trying to understand, not necessarily jump to the solution, but you're trying to understand what you can know about the problem to begin with. Richard Feynman. So when I was a kid, you're talking about my parents being in science, we had Richard Feynman's red lecture books, and he was a classic design thinker. He always tried to look at a problem and then try to figure out, could he build up to the solution of that problem from first principles? And I think that's something that's, one, difficult to learn. And there's a lot of impatience that gets in the way there, right? So I've run many different kinds of, and I'm sure you've done this, many kinds of sessions, like brainstorming sessions, and people are thinking, wait, aren't we going backwards at this point? If we're designing a car, yes, there needs to be 8 cup holders and there needs to be 4 wheels. And it's like, no, what you're trying to do is you're trying to make sure, are we solving the right problem? And I think, maybe Daniel Pink kind of outlined this the best. He just called it right-brained thinking, right? It's strategic thinking. Many times in our organizations, we default to left-brain thinking, which is very analytical thinking. And that's, only gets you so far, but it also ignores the fact that the world is filled with different kinds of problems. And the way I would, just sort of define tame versus wild problems, tame problems have already been solved in some way. There's already best practices. So if you're at Facebook and you're like, well, we need to update the sign-in page. Well, there's a way to do that. We know there has to be email and a password and, forget password. Like when you're trying to figure out, for example, what to do with a new large language model, there are no best practices because we don't really know how these things work. So questioning the question becomes really critical. And that's usually the missed first step.
And so how does it show up now in Domo? Can you talk about Domo as a business and about how design thinking plays out in that business?
Yeah. I helped start Domo with Josh James 13 years ago. We met. I didn't know him before. And he said, Chris, I've got this idea for a business. I want to be able to run my business from my phone, right? And as a CEO, I've got a problem. I never really know what I need to know and where to find it. How many people work here at any given moment? How much money is in the bank? Who are our top customers? Those kinds of questions. And I was immediately attracted to the idea because on the surface, that seems like a simple problem, right? It's like, well, we can just tell you. There's a dashboard that can tell you that. But his passion was not to start yet another business. His passion was to solve a much deeper problem, which was how can we put all of this growing information that floats around us and is hidden around us to work in new kinds of ways to help unlock a lot of potential in the organization. And hopefully, in my case, I'd like to unlock a lot more creative thinking in the organization. So right from the get-go, we applied design thinking principles to this. We didn't necessarily call these out, but we did things like, you're probably familiar with it, but like scenario planning. So starting a tech startup 13 years ago and trying to figure out where it's going to be in just 5 years is considered almost fruitless, right? Like things change too fast. But what we did was we applied, for example, scenario planning, which is like a storytelling approach where you can say, let's try to predict 4 different futures in a quadrant. Is it going to be an open source future versus, on-prem closed source? Is it going to be mobile or is it going to be desktop, right? You choose the axes. And then what you do is you try to describe as well as you can what that future looks like in each one of those 4 different kind of outcomes. The point of it is we didn't have to worry about being right. We just had to worry about describing it well enough so we could start to build confidence that the world was moving in the right direction. And when, sometimes I get called upon to go talk to like investors at conferences and stuff, and they're like, well, tell us how you compete better than company X. And it's like, well, if you weren't thinking this way, you've built the wrong thing, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's the power of design thinking is you use storytelling techniques, you use very different kinds of creative techniques that might seem very far removed from the spreadsheet model, but yet come together and are just as essential.
Before we go further with the interview, I want to take a moment to tell you about one of our podcast sponsors, Augmented AI, and how they are transforming businesses with Gen AI solutions. Augmented AI specializes in helping organizations uncover and address internal workflow challenges that Gen AI can solve. Their comprehensive process starts by identifying and prioritizing business problems, and then assessing each based on value, effort, and risk. Once a problem is selected, the Augmented AI team tests and validates the solution to ensure that it works. Only after this thorough validation do they draft technical requirements, which serve as a blueprint for building and deploying the solutions. The real beauty of partnering with Augmented AI is that they don't just stop at strategy and feasibility studies. They actually stand up the solutions and manage them for you so you can focus on what you do best. If you're interested in experiencing this innovative approach to deploying Gen AI solutions, visit simplyaugmented.ai and click on the Learn More button. That's simplyaugmented.ai. Now back to the episode. And so when you go out to companies, part of the offering is helping them go through this process and understand how to use this process to solve whatever problems that they have.
Absolutely right. So, you called out something that's very smart, which is the approach was not to build one sort of bespoke tool, but to create a platform of capability to help companies solve their myriad problems. And I call that the Anna Karenina principle of business, right? Which is, the opening line of Anna Karenina, which is something like, all happy families are alike, all unhappy families are unalike in their own way. Those are our customers, right? Because they have created their own sort of misery in a way, right? Through trying to do the right things, building tech, internal politics, resource constraints, changing environments, competitive landscape, etc. There is no one tool that's going to help them. They need a platform of capability. And that's what we have tried to build. And that's how we, help companies kind of succeed in a way that they otherwise might be very stuck.
It's interesting to hear you talk about the way that design shows up in business and creativity shows up in business. One of the things that you hear as a response to AI is that by getting rid of all the mundane tasks that we do, that the machine is going to do for us, we're going to be allowed to live in this world where we are hyper creative and hyper strategic. Can you tell me from your perspective how you think about that? Do you
Sure.
think that's true? Do you think that, from your perspective, knowing what you know about design thinking and creativity, what is a world like that going to look like from your perspective?
Yeah. So that's obviously an extremely big question. And it's one that I think is creating a lot of anxiety for people right now. I think it's at the start why design leadership needs to rise up at this moment to help architect a future that we want to live in. Right. So that's part of it. But when I was a kid, since you brought it up, when I was a kid, I remember, sort of the promise of the future was computers were going to do all of our work and we were just going to like hang out in hammocks all day. I don't know if you remember that. It was like, there would be like these posters or videos and I'm like, but how do I make money? I mean, it wasn't really all
Yeah.
explained. Of course, the future never works out the way you expect. I think there's a few patterns that have reemerged time and time again. When I think of like the new AI models, in a way, they feel like a new version of Wikipedia. So we're seeing similar days where, okay, convenience is going to lead to over-reliance and lack of critical thinking or understanding, right? So it starts with kids, putting in term papers and going like, yeah, I'm just going to cut this paste from Wikipedia. And, that might work the first time. Now it's ChatGPT, right? So in user experience, we have, what we call heuristics, which are just sort of human behavior patterns. And one is principle of least effort, which is to say people are kind of lazy, right? And so that's kind of a
Yeah.
real danger, I think, of the new language models. And there's some concerning surveys that have come out. One, I think I was reading recently by Deloitte that showed that business leaders who use ChatGPT more seem to trust it more, which I would think it would have been opposite. In the same way, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that people will always default to a convenient answer versus a better answer that requires a little bit more work. So the models were designed to be convenient and designed to be helpful and designed to be confident sounding, right? Reading a paper the other day from Harvard, came out, it was called antagonistic AI. If we had started with an antagonistic model, people might have a very different sense of it. But their experience, because it's so easy and we're now part of this experiment, is like, oh, I put in 3 questions and it seemed like it answered it correctly. So why is it not answering everything correctly? That's going to be problematic. So building AI safety, building more explicit explanations and helping people sort of understand where did this information come from. There's a lot to be done there, but I think there's traps, right? And we're going to have to navigate some pretty serious ones. For example, like autopilots, in airplanes. We've been using automation and AI for a long time, but we still have, 1 or 2 pilots in the front seat. And that's
Yeah.
because the world is filled with kind of nasty edge cases that haven't been seen before. And in that case, you need a different kind of intelligence. So it's not, AI versus human. It's AI intelligence with certain characteristics with human intelligence with certain characteristics. We have to figure out how to design those to work better together. That's the big challenge.
Your comment about the way that large language models can be different is kind of interesting. One of the comments that I've been hearing out there as between Grok and between ChatGPT is Grok is a much more honest, less PC, a little bit more rough around the edges kind of model compared with ChatGPT, for example. So I wonder if in the future that's going to play out in lots of different styled foundational models that have different approaches to the way that they answer questions. So definitely very, very interesting. So I have a question for you about your process. Do you use ChatGPT to prototype? When you think about brainstorming and the kind of workshopping that I'm sure you do a lot of, how are you using AI in your daily practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I use it in a few different ways. So I think for certain folks, I'll definitely put myself in that camp. I like to use it as a way to help ideate faster. So one of the things I love about collaborating with other people is getting different perspectives. So just sort of throwing some ideas at ChatGPT is really helpful. It's also kind of a search engine. So making sure that, I might not be overlooking something. But I have never, at least up to this point, there's never been a time where I've, let's say I'm working on writing an article or writing some copy for, some UI. I've never found it possible to use anything that it gives me, just cut and paste. So there's definitely something there. Now, that said, I might have a little different take and a little different standards, but I do find it already becoming a super useful creative tool, along with things like Midjourney. But things like Midjourney, while they are very impressive, maybe at glance, there's always something missing, right? There's always something that's a little off, something a little too polished, something a little too inauthentic. And I like to tell my designers, like, stay human, right? Like, don't give up yet, right? Like, it's too early. You still bring a lot to the table. But in terms of a process, one of the things we've done is we've started using, creating our own assistants, for example, to help up-level other designers' writing. So I could sit down and try to teach every designer to write better, and I've written style guides on writing. Or I create a chat assistant that's trained on my writing and on the rules. And if those rules don't exist, default to these rules. It's not perfect, but what it does do is it scales well and helps everyone do better, with very little effort. And I think what's really critical, what you're going to see more of, the content and the better sort of decision making is brought to them where they're doing their work. So I can create a Figma plugin, for example, that says, correct or suggest better copy, versus, go find that manual somewhere and put the work in. Again, convenience usually wins out. So if I can be convenient and credible, that's the spot I want to be at, the win-win.
And now, before we dive deeper, I want to take a quick moment and tell you a little bit about one of our podcast partners. As a listener of this show, I know you're trying to stay on top of all things AI and tech, which is why you have to check out the amazing GeekWire podcast, produced by GeekWire and hosted by Todd Bishop. It's a treasure of insights featuring industry leaders and the latest tech trends that are shaping our world, and the perfect companion podcast to shift AI. GeekWire podcast is where technology meets curiosity and covers the world of technology, startups, and geek culture. Expand your tech horizons and join the conversation. Tune into the GeekWire podcast today, a perfect complement to our own discussions here. Don't miss out. Follow the GeekWire podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite listening app. Now back to the episode. Yeah, absolutely. That's interesting. As I think about the work that you do, the brainstorming, especially with different kinds of companies, I imagine that you're always thinking about a future that doesn't exist and trying to imagine different futures for different scenarios. So the question I have for you is, as you look out into the future 5 to 10 years, understanding that things are moving so fast and we're not really going to know what it's going to look like, what kind of frameworks do you use to think about these unknowns? And do you have opinions about what this future is going to look like, given all the changes, the rapid changes that we've been having now?
Yeah. So looking into the crystal ball, I think is actually a skill that you can begin to develop over time. Years ago, I think it was around 2001, I published with a colleague, Shane Bowman, a paper called We Media. And it essentially predicted the rise of social media. I didn't know that's what it was going to be called. So I was a little off. Called it We Media, not social media. And this was before, I think Wikipedia was, when we published, was about 5 months old. Twitter was not anywhere on the horizon, et cetera. But the way we did that was, I think, using techniques that, I definitely use today, which is, what are sort of the major sort of shifts in technology and shifts in attitudes and, everything from, sort of the social landscape to the competitive landscape to the different kinds of sort of global issues that are arising. So, for example, when we were thinking about social media at the time, there was a few thousand blogs online, right? Like, people didn't know what to call these things. No one knew what a blog was. And that led to, though, getting a glimpse, a little spark of some kind of future that you couldn't just extrapolate unless you took into account the different forces that might pull it in a certain kind of way. So the big thing when it came to social media and We Media was focusing on the fact that the internet was not just a disruptive technology, but was a sort of a wild kind of technology in the same way that we're talking about wild problems that created new kinds of disruptive technologies. And those disruptive technologies, being information based, allowed ideas, talent, resources, etc., to move across the globe without constraint. Now all of a sudden you're thinking, oh, this is more than just going to disrupt the newspaper business. This has geopolitical implications. What happens when you're guarding a border, but your people and your ideas are just moving back and forth? What happens when a newspaper is not the only way you get information, but every person on the planet becomes a potential news outlet? That was what we sort of proposed. And that became sort of the blueprint for CNN, MSNBC, BBC. They all started to use that. And even companies like Ford and Big Pharma started taking notice of how can we partner with people formerly known as our customers, or in the case of newspapers, people formerly known as our audience. So applying those sort of rules today, or those guidelines today, it's looking for these sort of major shifts and forces and how are they pulling things forward. And so right now with AI, I think best case scenario, AI becomes the partner, in all of our jobs, in all of our creative endeavors, in all of our entertainment, moments, right? There's a lot of big implications with that. And who's going to serve, who's going to succeed and who's going to feel, left out in that, hard to tell. I think of something I think Benedict Evans talks about, which is a quote from Carl Sagan that said, when the car was invented, no one had any problem imagining cars driving around everywhere. No one imagined Walmart, right? So these are the second, third order effects. Those are the ones that I think are going to be kind of exciting and surprising. But I don't know if that helps, but that's how I think about it.
Yeah. Well, the notion of AI as a partner is an interesting one. And my next question for you is about people that have been your partners along the way, your mentors along the way, and how they've helped you over time. Who are some of those mentors and what are the ways that they've impacted you?
Yeah. So I think mentoring is just one of those kind of gifts, if you're lucky enough to find the right person or people that you just keep coming back to and revisiting, even though you may not be talking to them. My first mentor was my next door neighbor. He was an entrepreneur, and I think he helped give me the sense that I could be an entrepreneur in a way that my parents couldn't. They were kind of, that was not their personality. They weren't comfortable with certain levels of risk. And he also treated me, even as a young teen, as an adult. I remember one time we were driving home, and we were in Boston because I grew up in New England. We were driving home from Boston. There was a lot of traffic, and instead of sitting in the traffic, he's like, "Let's go buy some clothes." And so he went to this very expensive men's clothing store and bought a truckload of clothes. And I was like, I think he saw me sort of puzzled. He's like, "Chris, for guys like us, money doesn't buy happiness, but it can sure soothe a few wounds." And I was like, wow, because I thought it was all about money, right? I thought I just need to be rich. I need to have a BMW. He's like, no, it's just a tool, right? And he also had a way of weathering the ups and downs of entrepreneurship in a way that I just never saw. Because you're going to have good days, you're going to have bad days. But he always had a vision, and he never let go of that. And he was excited about the journey. Yeah, so I would say he was probably my biggest mentor when it came to business.
Yeah, that's great. That's good. That's a good story. So the last question I have for you is one that I ask everybody. And it's a limiting question, but I think it also is an expansive question, which is, if you could think about the future of work in 2 words, what would those 2 words be? And then you can elaborate on them.
All right. I'm gonna go with a term I heard recently, digital dexterity.
Okay.
And to elaborate, there's a few aspects of that. One is always be learning, right? You're always going to be adapting. This is only accelerating. And that, as we talked about earlier, when you think about, sort of the scenarios, the nature of the technology being as disruptive as it is, the nature of global competition being as competitive as it means that you can't let your foot off the pedal, right? So we're all going to be kind of relearning and up-leveling our skills and adjusting our roles. You're already seeing that. it's just going to accelerate. And I think as a second part of that, you're always on, right? So the technologies have done things like we can do today. Geography is not a problem, right? Geography shrinks with technology. Time takes on a different aspect, right? So I can pay attention when I need to pay attention. And with AI, all of a sudden you have the ability to maybe work in ways that you didn't imagine and in different situations than you would imagine. So I would say digital dexterity is going to be the future of work.
I love that. I love that. Well, I think that the conversation around human-centered design, design thinking, I really do believe that we're going to have to be more human as we get all these tools that we're going to be using to be more efficient. And I think the ones that are more human are going to be a lot more valuable. Folks that are that understand design thinking, that understand emotional intelligence. And so I really, really appreciate you being on the show. I think it's an interesting perspective that we haven't really talked a lot about. And so it was fun to speak with you about it.
Oh, I appreciate that. And I really love your point about emotional intelligence. That's only going to become more critical.
Thanks a lot for being on Shift AI, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Oh, thanks, Boaz. Appreciate it.
That's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in. Such a pleasure to have Chris as our guest on today's episode. Chris brings an interesting perspective on how AI and data can come together to drive smarter decisions for businesses and create impactful outcomes. If you want to stay connected to Chris, you can find him on LinkedIn. And if you are interested in how he thinks about AI and data analysis, definitely connect with him and keep up with his posts and activities online. I continue to be amazed by the guests we've had on the show, and I'm excited about the ones joining us in the near future. I truly appreciate you spending your time with us. Thank you for listening to this episode, and don't forget to subscribe to the Shift AI podcast for more exciting interviews, and to the Augmented AI Weekly newsletter for updates on how AI can help you scale your business. The Shift AI podcast is syndicated by GeekWire, and we are grateful to have the show sponsored by Augmented AI. Our theme music was created by Dave Angel.